Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare and life sciences. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the lawyers at Epstein Becker Green, a leading law firm that has decades of experience serving clients in the healthcare and life sciences industries nationwide.
Today on Diagnosing Healthcare, we will discuss key compliance issues for industry stakeholders to consider during implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act's drug pricing provisions. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Alexis Boaz. I'm an attorney in Epstein Becker Green's healthcare and life sciences practice based out of our Washington, D.C. office. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, or the IRA, was signed into law on August 16, 2022. The law included significant and controversial drug pricing provisions. Since being signed into law, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, has started what will be a years-long process to implement the IRA's drug price provisions. Unlike the implementation process used for most new laws, Congress deferred a significant amount of discretion to CMS, including allowing CMS to implement major provisions of the law through guidance documents rather than through usual notice and comment rulemaking, including to implement the Medicare Prescription Drug Inflation Rebate Program and the Medicare Drug Price Negotiations Program, which will be the focus of today. On today's show, we're going to talk about key considerations for industry as CMS works its way through the initial stages of implementation of the Medicare Drug Price Negotiations Program and the Medicare Prescription Drug Inflation Rebate Program under the IRA. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe to the show. Diagnosing Healthcare is available wherever you get your podcasts. Joining our discussion today is Connie Wilkinson. Connie concentrates her practice on pricing and reimbursement policy, commercial pricing, federal health care, and health benefits program issues, and contracting strategies for pharmaceutical, medical device, and products, and biotechnology industries. Connie regularly advises direct and indirect providers in the healthcare industry regarding pharmaceutical pricing and program compliance. Also joining us today is Leslie Norwalk. Leslie serves as an advisor to 3 private equity firms and sits on the boards of directors of Arvinas, Motive Care, Neurocrine Biosciences, Nuvasive, and several privately held healthcare corporations. Leslie is also a member of APCO Worldwide's International Advisory Council. Leslie previously served as acting administrator to the Bush administration for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, where she was responsible for implementing the original Medicare drug benefit. Thank you both for joining us today.
Alexis, you neglected to mention how much I enjoy working with you and Connie in Epstein Becker Green's healthcare practice in Washington, D.C. Thank you for having us. It's certainly a fascinating discussion.
Thank you both for joining us. Before diving into things, I'll give a status update on IRA implementation. While some of the IRA drug pricing provisions were implemented early, many of the significant provisions, including the Inflation Rebate Program and Negotiations Program, will be implemented over several years. CMS released a timeline to outline expected implementation and so far has kept to that schedule, already releasing the expected materials for spring 2023. This includes significant initial guidance documents for both the Rebate Program and the Negotiations Program, and most recently, an information collection request for the negotiations program addressing the counteroffer form that manufacturers must use as part of negotiations. Comments for this are due June 20th, 2023. We're expecting a lot of activity from CMS during the summer. We definitely urge stakeholders to take opportunities to submit comments. EBG will be tracking that activity closely and advising clients on those issues and responding to opportunities for comment. Let's dive a little bit more into the negotiations program. Acknowledging that there are countless questions and issues we could discuss about the IRA's drug pricing provisions, what are your top 2 issues or questions based on initial guidance and other information released so far?
When I was the deputy administrator for CMS, one of the things that I did, as you noted, was implement the Medicare prescription drug benefit as it was originally set forth in 2003. Historically, the Medicare drug benefit had a provision that said that the government could not interfere with price negotiations between drug plans and pharmaceutical manufacturers. This non-interference provision was controversial from the day it became law, even though the concept had been proposed at one time or another by both Democrats and Republicans. 20 years later, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, changes that and requires CMS to negotiate at least some drug prices under the Medicare Part D program, as well as under the Medicare Part B program. The IRA includes everything from how CMS has defined a single source drug, aggregating various routes of administration to elements that CMS will consider in the negotiation of what is known as the, quote, maximum fair price, end quote. Interestingly, CMS chose two different metrics relating to drug costs for the Medicare Part D program. In the draft mega guidance, as it's known, CMS stated that it would use the gross covered prescription drug costs when determining the list of drugs that are eligible for negotiation, and in fact, the likely drugs for those 10 that will be negotiated by CMS and the manufacturer in the first year for implementation in 2026. This metric determines how much the drug is at the point of sale. So the gross covered prescription drug costs exclude rebates that are determined after the point of sale. On the other hand, CMS stated that it would use the net covered prescription drug costs to begin the calculation of maximum fair price. These net drug costs lower the ultimate price of the drug because CMS defines the net price as that which includes all of the direct and indirect remuneration that is determined after the point of sale. The impact of dividing the gross prescription drug cost versus the net prescription drug cost is severalfold. First, because CMS is using the gross prescription drug cost to determine which drugs are eligible, manufacturers may be less likely to negotiate the after-the-fact rebates that are incorporated in the net covered prescription drug costs. And thus, those manufacturers are more likely to move any discounts forward to the point of sale. So in the first instance, they get credit for those discounts, and that may impact the selection of eligible drugs. And secondly, it wouldn't impact the maximum fair price ceiling, as all the discounts and rebates would be included in the net cost anyway. Now, this is a benefit to those consumers who need these top drugs, as the price at the counter is likely to be less. However, historically, rebates and discounts that occurred after the point of sale serve to decrease the prescription drug premiums for all Medicare Part D enrollees in a particular drug plan. And these discounts may decrease across the board, even if a drug isn't selected. So consequently, the question is, might premiums increase in a way they would not have without this? And how are others impacted when moving the drug discounts from after the fact to the point of sale? Does it impact formulary placement or rules around step therapy? And generally, how are pharmacy benefit managers and pharmaceutical manufacturers going to respond to CMS's difference between the gross price and the net price in determining both the drugs that are selected and the ultimate maximum fair price in terms of the negotiation?
So I think I'd like to pick up on a couple of the things that Leslie has raised, and just to point out some of the concerns that people have in response to them. I think the whole question of the selection of the drugs eligible for negotiation based on the gross covered prescription drug cost, even if the ultimate selection, the ultimate negotiation of the maximum fair price would take into account the net prices, is whether that's really going to undermine the intention of the statute, at least to a certain extent. And this is an issue that the PBMs are very concerned about. Part of the issue is that if what's going into that first broader pool is only based on prices that don't reflect any price concessions, then the fact that those get taken into account later in deciding which ones actually get negotiated can make sure that if you have one in the original pool that in fact does have significant price concessions, then it may not end up getting negotiated, but it can't incorporate into the pool the ones that weren't included initially based on the lines being drawn the way CMS is proposing to do it. So I think from the PBM's perspective, there's some concerns that what will be going into the pool for negotiation to begin with will include products that already are being successfully negotiated down to reasonable prices. And so in some sense, it's maybe a lost opportunity to focus more on the drugs where there really are higher prices that are being used all the way through the process, rather than those where there's simply a higher list price.
The next issue that caught my attention is what is the burden on what CMS calls the primary manufacturer to do a number of things. So the primary manufacturer is the one who has the drug that is actually selected. The primary manufacturer is responsible for ensuring that all beneficiaries who need a covered drug are offered that maximum fair price. And that means all enrollees in prescription drug plans, including regular and employer retiree Medicare Advantage plans. Currently, I don't believe that primary manufacturers may know what price the enrollee is actually paying at the pharmacy, because that would also include things like a dispensing fee. But not only are primary manufacturers now responsible for ensuring that enrollees have access to the maximum fair price, they're also responsible for ensuring that anything that's offered by a secondary manufacturer, like an authorized generic, is offered at the maximum fair price. In other words, the primary manufacturer is responsible to ensure that even the secondary manufacturer's prices are no more than that maximum fair price. And so that would mean that everything that's offered, authorized generics, as well as the brand, that primary manufacturer is responsible for ensuring the maximum fair price is provided to all enrollees, pharmacies, mail order services, and the like. So that's, I think, quite a burden on a primary manufacturer in terms of what they need to do. In addition, primary manufacturers are also responsible for the collection and reporting of negotiation data elements, not only of the collection and submission of their own, but also of those of the secondary manufacturer.
So Leslie raises an interesting point with respect to the onus that is being put on the manufacturer in a number of instances under the IRA in terms of how the pricing or the rebates will be operationalized. And I think it's a valid point to note that manufacturers aren't always in a position in the way the drug flows through the supply chain to be able to intercede at the appropriate moment where they could guarantee that the price would be applied in a particular way. And one of the proposals that CMS is making is that there will be some provision for the maximum fair price to be implemented through a chargeback process, which will try to marry up an adjustment to the purchase that's flowing through the pharmacy to ensure that ultimately the maximum fair price is married up to what is actually being paid for the drug. While chargeback systems are used by wholesalers currently in effectuating contract prices that manufacturers have agreed to, that's normally to a purchaser, not to a pharmacy dispensing. So this will be sort of an additional level of complexity. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that a lot of these systems may implicate additional expenses for manufacturers, as well as the price concessions that they're being required to give, because whoever is implementing the chargeback may think that they're entitled to a fee for it. And so there may be a number of these other vendors who are required to make this system actually work the way CMS is envisioning it, that will be requiring some other sort of fee-for-service arrangement in order for them to do what the manufacturer would need them to do for this to work. One of the other issues that I think is particularly interesting in the question of the process and the elements for the negotiation of the maximum fair price is the consideration of the clinical effectiveness of the drug. And one of the things that we've seen already in some of the comments that are being made around CMS's initial guidance on the rebate negotiation and some of those factors that'll be taken into account is the question of who will actually be producing that clinical effectiveness evidence, or on what will that be based. And we've already seen some suggestions that the input for that process should be outsourced to other entities who are already doing that in the industry, such as ICER or CHARM. One of the things that came out is the white paper that USC Schaefer published, where they are suggesting, without pointing names to who in particular should be involved, that the process for the price determination should be based on generalized risk-adjusted cost-effectiveness methodologies that will make sure that value is actually being taken into account in a meaningful way in that process. And that's really is one issue that I think is more consistent with the underlying intent of the law. What's been happening so far, I think, is CMS has been focusing on a very pragmatic approach to implementation where they're focusing on some of the elements that are more straightforward, more controllable. There are objective sources already existing that can provide the basis for the calculations. And they're moving forward with an implementation that hews fairly closely to that type of available and easily accessible factors. But I think part of what I think the law was intended to do was to figure out how to base, not simply how to lower drug prices, although that's clearly one of the goals, but to sort of right size the price by basing it on what the actual value of the drug is. And I think some of these comments that are being made by think tanks, by others around how this particular facet of the negotiation should work are trying to get at that point of finding a way to focus back really on the value of the drug. And one of the other suggestions or recommendations made by USC Schaefer in the white paper is that there should be some flexibility for situations where there's actually new evidence produced about the effectiveness of a product, whether that's in connection with a new indication or expansion to a different population or whatever the reason would be, that when there's actually new and better clinical evidence that's being established, that there should be some delay in when the price negotiation begins for those drugs in order to incentivize that kind of evidence development. And it seems to me that at least that concept is certainly a critical piece of making sure that what we end up with in the end are not just lower priced drugs, but appropriately priced drugs and without stifling innovation or the continued development of what could be beneficial therapies for patients.
Yeah, Connie, interestingly, CMS does regularly determine what's reasonable and necessary. That's their statutory requirement. In doing so, in other areas, it will often use an outside physician panel or contractor medical directors to educate those within CMS in the Baltimore office whether and how Medicare should cover a service or treatment. Well, I can't imagine that CMS would totally give up oversight to an outside group for this type of evidence development. I suspect it would welcome information from groups like ICER, et cetera, to help make its determination as it moves forward and perhaps augment what it may be doing internally when looking at, as you said, the actual value of the drug. I also found it interesting that at least in its draft guidance, that CMS has said that therapeutic alternatives that it's going to consider will simply be those prescription drug alternatives. That could have been broader. It just was interesting to me that it decided to go, at least in the draft, a narrower route. That's not to state that manufacturers wouldn't want to show CMS that it's possible that a particular drug is going to reduce, say, hospital spending, for example, if it's used in the Medicare population, and therefore could reduce overall Medicare costs, not just prescription drug costs. So I think this is an area that we will see evolve over time as CMS implements this over the next couple of years. And it wouldn't surprise me if this area in particular changes in some way, shape, or form as CMS gets more experience at putting it into place.
No, that's a really good point, Leslie. And I think part of the challenge of the process we're in is that because of the very short timeframes under the IRA for implementation of a number of these programs, CMS is being forced to, I think the saying is, fly the airplane while building it. And because of that, I think there are cases in which they are taking what I think is that pragmatic route of finding what they can build on that they already have in existence, rather than necessarily going to maybe the most sophisticated approach, and that will evolve over time.
From a compliance perspective, what are key actions companies should be taking now, or at least thinking about now, to prepare for the Medicare drug price negotiation program?
Well, noncompliance with a number of provisions of the IRA carries a very hefty price tag of $100 million. This is far beyond anything I've ever seen in my 3 decades in focusing on Medicare requirements, et cetera. If I'm a company, particularly if I'm a primary manufacturer, not only am I concerned about how I'm going to ensure that Part D enrollees have access to the maximum fair price, which any company that could be selected in the top 10 drugs should be doing now, I think it's important for all manufacturers to consider the following. The first is determining the inputs to drug costs. So if I'm a primary manufacturer, I would be concerned about how I determine what research and development costs are and whether they should be attributed to one particular drug or another, and whether those costs have been recouped and how I'm going to account for all of that going forward. So even if I might not be selected for a drug in the first or second round, R&D costs could be accruing over time, and I would want to ensure that I'm going to adequately account for any particular drug. So how am I going to attribute those to one drug or another? I would have a similar question for unit costs for production and distribution that need to be averaged across the primary and any secondary manufacturers. Also, market data, including revenue and sales volume data, again, for both the primary and secondary manufacturers. Any federal financial support and how that can be determined for novel therapeutic discovery. How am I going to attribute that to one drug or another drug, given that you could imagine a place where you've got a whole new platform where some drugs or any number of drugs could benefit from financial support or R&D costs or unit costs, et cetera. So how is that going to be attributed across the board for future use, as well as making sure you've got information on exclusivity from patents or other approvals? So that's one component. Another component for compliance is if a drug has an authorized generic or is otherwise repackaged or relabeled, then the issue of the primary manufacturer being responsible for the secondary manufacturer comes into play. So I'd want to review any contracts between the primary and secondary manufacturers to determine what would need to be rewritten or added and what reporting the secondary manufacturer would make to the primary manufacturer. And it's not just reporting, it's auditing, et cetera. And how is it that you'd like that information if you're the primary manufacturer? So those negotiations are probably better had sooner rather than later if you're going to have an authorized generic or it's otherwise going to be repackaged or relabeled. And then thirdly, CMS prohibits primary manufacturers from disclosing any information regarding its initial offer from CMS or any subsequent offer by CMS, including the ceiling price that's contained in the offer or any information contained in any justification that's provided with that offer. CMS has proposed that primary manufacturers destroy all information that's received by CMS through this negotiation process within 30 days after the drug no longer qualifies as a selected drug. So information control is going to be very important for those primary manufacturers who have a drug selected, because that information is going to need to be deleted, and the primary manufacturer is going to have to sign on the dotted line telling CMS that all the information has in fact been deleted once that drug no longer qualifies. So making sure that anyone who might have access to that information can put it in a special place, because at some point in the future, it would need to be deleted. So I think it sounds easy, but I suspect knowing how information can get out of control, it's going to be a lot harder to implement than one might imagine. And figuring out how to put a compliance program around that information and the protection of that information, I think is going to be an important part of what a primary manufacturer does going forward.
In addition to some of the issues that Leslie has raised, I think operationally, there are all sorts of challenges that the IRA implementation presents, and a number of them will require some compliance elements being built in, even at this point in the process. I think one of the first issues that manufacturers should be addressing, And I know some have already plunged into this. I think others are still getting their hands around it, but they need to be identifying which products in their product master will be affected by these various changes and when. So in other words, when will, if they're single source or innovator multiple source products that are going to be subject to the negotiation, for example, when will they be eligible based on the date of approval? Do they fall into any of the excluded categories? And going ahead and mapping out when you can expect for there to be some impact or potential impact to those. Another element of this, and all of these should be sort of cross-functional activities to make sure that the various stakeholders within the company are participating and sort of bringing the best information and expertise to bear on them. But I think this next one would involve some coordination with the finance team to do some projections of what the financial impact will be or would be for the rebates and how you could establish appropriate accruals for these to base your financial statements on. A third one would be to look at launch planning and pricing strategy for products. And this may include sort of life cycle of products as well, and whether there are products that may need to be transferred or retired or other actions taken because of what their posture would be under these new requirements. One of the points that was raised by Leslie that I think is particularly critical is the question of the research and development costs and how you're going to try to calculate those, attribute those, take them into account appropriately. One of the things that you should be looking at is whether there's some interrelationship with state price transparency reporting requirements and looking to see whether there are ways to achieve consistency with the way you may be including those in reports that states may already be requiring, or if there's no way of achieving consistency to document what the difference is in the standard for the requirement. That means that these won't sync up neatly from one report to what you're including to support the negotiation. And these are things that should really be turned into some standards, whether those are policies and procedures, whether there are some assumptions, but to sort of document a thoughtful process around some of these things, even as we're waiting to see what the final guidelines will be once we've gone through the various information collection and proposed rule processes that CMS is proposing.
Great. So before we bring the podcast to a close, maybe we can address the inflation rebate program a bit. Just as some background, under the inflation rebate program, manufacturers must pay a penalty or rebate amount on certain Part B or Part D drugs that have had a price increase greater than the rate of inflation over a specific time period based on CMS's calculations. CMS will post the Part B rebatable drug list quarterly and release its first list earlier this spring. Starting April 1st, CMS imposed coinsurance limitations for the drugs on that list. Part D will use an annual reporting period, which started back on October 1st, 2022. CMS will start invoicing manufacturers in 2025 for rebate amounts and will impose penalties on manufacturers that fail to pay rebates. CMS released initial draft guidance for both Part B and Part D earlier this spring that went into significant detail on nearly every aspect of the rebate program, and CMS plans to issue revised guidance again later this year. Connie, could you talk about the program from a compliance perspective and what key actions companies should be taking now, or at least thinking about taking now, in response to the rebate program?
Thanks, Alexis. I'll be happy to. So, as we know, these inflation penalty rebates are new to Medicare, which has lacked a specific mechanism for limiting price increases for either the Part D physician-administered drugs or the Part D retail prescription drugs. But inflation penalties are not new to pharmaceutical manufacturers. The Medicaid drug rebate program has had an inflationary rebate in place since 1993 for brand drugs. That's calculated as the difference between a drug's current quarter AMP and its baseline AMP adjusted by the CPIU for the same period. And this produces significant, what they call additional rebates for those products. And a similar inflation penalty went into effect for generic drugs about 5 years ago, based on 2014 pricing. And again, under the VA Federal Supply Schedule program, there's an inflation-based component in the calculation of federal ceiling price, although it resets every 5 years. So what's challenging from a compliance perspective is that the inflation penalties are all slightly different, with different measurement periods, different baselines, different benchmark prices, and based on different subsets of a manufacturer's commercial sales. So manufacturers will need to make sure they're appreciating these differences to implement each one correctly. Under the IRA, the rebate penalty the drug company will pay will be the difference between the drug's published price in a base year, not necessarily tied to launch the way the Medicaid drug rebate program was meant to be. And this benchmark price will be compared to the current price, inflation adjusted, multiplied by the volume of sales to Medicare to come up with the calculation of the rebates. And so as you were noting, some of the differences include that for Part B, the benchmark price is the inflation adjusted Part B payment rate, the published ASP rate, and the rebates established on a quarterly basis, whereas for Part D, the benchmark price will be based on an annual AMP, which will be a new calculation that manufacturers don't currently perform. And interestingly, under the IRA, there are a number of significant new calculations and price submissions that manufacturers will be responsible for, including annual non-FAMP, annual ASP, annual WAC, in addition to the maximum fair price for the drugs that are subject to negotiation. And it's important to remember that manufacturers are subject to certifications for all the price submissions they make to the various federal programs. So there can be significant existing civil monetary penalties for failures in accurate reporting. And so for all these reasons, it's critical that manufacturers are putting together enhanced procedures or new procedures to make sure that they're incorporating these new price reporting obligations into the existing processes they have for the reports that exist already.
It's safe to say that manufacturers have a lot on their plate.
Yes.
To close out the podcast, maybe you could each talk about what you think is the most underrated component, requirement, or issue of the IRA's drug pricing provisions that you think industry should keep its eye on. We can start with you, Connie.
There's a couple of things that I'd like to raise at this point. I think the burden on the manufacturers as a whole has been underrated because it's not limited to just the financial implications of the price constraints, where I think most of the focus has been so far. And it's not even limited to the significant penalties that will apply if a manufacturer fails to comply with its obligations, either to pay the inflation rebate, to agree to negotiate, to comply with the agreement to negotiate, to charge no more than the maximum fair price, or for knowingly submitting false information and claiming the small biotech exemption. And all of these have various civil monetary penalty provisions, including and up to the $100 million penalty for submitting false information and claiming the small biotech exemption, which, Leslie, I know is one that makes you apoplectic. But I think beyond that, there are all sorts of operational challenges. And we've talked, I think, globally about some of what the manufacturers should be doing and should be focused on. But I think this is an area where there are many moving parts, and manufacturers need to stay tuned for developments not only across the various federal drug pricing programs, but across the industry. There's obvious interaction among the federal programs in terms of what other program prices are being used as reference prices or benchmarks under the IRA, and how the IRA rebates and prices will be treated in each of those other pricing calculations. But there's also changes beyond drug pricing that are going to affect implementation and business decisions. And this includes things like the Medicare plan, the guidance on the new benefit design structure, on reimbursement. And you can see some of that interplay between things like the plan guidance addressing the gross covered prescription drug costs and the changes that they're going to make to the definition there because of what it's being used for under the IRA, and needing to make sure that there's no confusion between the two. And so looking at some of these other, in some ways, what seem like tangentially related program developments under both the Medicare program and some of the ones that provide the derivative benchmarks is going to be important as we move this forward and manufacturers try to figure out what are the implications across the board, across all of their different federal pricing for the products that are subject in one way or another to the IRA. And this is going to involve, I think, a lot of cross-functional coordination, because these aren't just issues for the government pricing team of the manufacturer. They're going to involve the commercial groups. They're going to involve the business development groups as they evaluate what the company will focus on in terms of product development moving forward, and what these changes, what impact they have on the value of the products, the financial business value of the products already under development. So it is an area where there is a lot of room, I think, for different protocols and different processes to be developed across the organization that will benefit the company in trying to react to the IRA implementation.
Yeah, Connie, I would agree with your assessment wholeheartedly. And really just the point you made regarding the burden that falls on pharmaceutical manufacturers is really far beyond that of the price that would ultimately be determined as the maximum fair price in the negotiation, whether it's the inflation provisions that take effect much earlier and how that might impact how one initially prices a drug, for example. I think those things are perhaps known and discussed. But the burden that CMS has put on manufacturers from a compliance perspective, and in ways that the manufacturer may not have historically had information regarding what happens downstream, I think can really change how the entire industry is required to work if the implementation goes as CMS has set forth currently. I'm not sure that all of the varying organizations that may be impacted are ready to appreciate what they need to do today so that they can be prepared in the future. And so I think that's one component that is perhaps underestimated. But otherwise, I totally agree with your assessment and just wanted to highlight that particular provision.
No, I think that's helpful, Leslie. And I think one of the other issues you allude to is that in addition to sort of evaluating what kinds of changes in manufacturers' contracting may be needed, they're going to need to be able to work those through the process with those other business partners. And there certainly, I think, will be a significant level of effort in realigning a lot of those current contracting relationships and processes in a way that will allow the manufacturers to remain successful with these new obligations.
Thank you, Leslie and Connie, for taking time to participate in today's discussion on the Inflation Reduction Act. Thank you to all of our listeners. I'm your host, Alexis Boaz. If you like what you've heard today, please don't forget to subscribe. Diagnosing Health Care is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Health Care. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare and life sciences, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. This podcast is presented by Epstein Becker Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.